You know this story. You've known it since childhood. A little girl in a red cloak, a basket of food, a grandmother's cottage deep in the woods, and somewhere along the path, waiting in shadow, a wolf. It's one of the first fairy tales we learn. Simple, innocent, a warning dressed in familiar shapes. But if you listen closely, something about it doesn't quite settle. The pieces fit together too neatly, as if they've been arranged by hands much later than the ones that first told it. What we call Little Red Riding Hood feels complete, but it also feels edited, softened at the edges, like a stone worn smooth by centuries of retelling. Let's begin with the version most of us remember. A young girl is sent by her mother to visit her sick grandmother. She wears a red cloak, bright and unmistakable. Her mother gives her a basket of bread and wine, warnings to stay on the path, and sends her into the forest alone. The girl obeys. She walks carefully at first, but then she meets the wolf. He speaks to her, not with growls or snarls, but with words calm, curious, almost kind. He asks where she's going. She tells him. The wolf suggests she pick flowers for her grandmother to make the visit sweeter. The girl agrees. She steps off the path. While she gathers flowers, the wolf runs ahead. He arrives at the grandmother's cottage, knocks on the door, imitates the girl's voice, and is let inside. What happens next is told quickly in the Grimm version, almost as if the teller is hurrying past it. The wolf devours the grandmother. He puts on her nightcap and climbs into her bed. When the girl arrives, she notices something strange. Her grandmother looks different. The famous exchange follows those questions we all remember. What big ears you have, what big eyes you have, what big teeth you have. And then the wolf devours her too. In the Grimm Brothers' telling, the story doesn't end there. A huntsman, passing by the cottage, hears strange sounds. He enters, sees the wolf asleep with a swollen belly, and cuts it open with scissors. Out tumble the girl and her grandmother, alive and unharmed. They fill the wolf's belly with stones. When he wakes and tries to run, the weight kills him. The girl returns home safely. She has learned her lesson. The story ends. It's a tidy conclusion. A rescue, a punishment for the villain, a warning for children to obey their parents and stay on the path. It feels like a fairy tale should frightening enough to be memorable, but ultimately safe. And yet, if this is the story we know, why does it feel like something is missing? The Grimm brothers collected this tale in the early 19th century, writing it down from German oral tradition. But they weren't simply recording what they heard. They were editing, refining, reshaping. They removed elements they found inappropriate for children. They softened endings. They added morals. What they published was a version of the story, not the first version, and certainly not the oldest. Before the Grimms, there was Charles Perrault. In 1697, in France, he published a collection of tales that included one called Le Petit Chaperon Rouge, Little Red Riding Hood. His version was darker. There was no huntsman, no rescue, no grandmother pulled from the wolf's belly, alive and grateful. In Perrault's story, the wolf eats the girl, and that's where it ends. But even Perrault's version wasn't the beginning. Folklorists have traced this story back further, into oral traditions that existed long before anyone thought to write them down. In some of these older tellings, the details become stranger, more unsettling. The red cloak isn't always red, the wolf isn't always a wolf, and what happens in the grandmother's cottage is told with a frankness that doesn't belong in children's books. The story we know, the one with the rescue, the stones, the happy ending, is a revision, a rewriting, a choice made by people who decided this tale needed to be gentler than it was. But if the story was changed, that means it was once something else, something older, something darker, something that survived in whispers and warnings passed between mothers and daughters in villages where the forest was not a storybook place, but a real and dangerous threshold. The tale we think we know is not the tale that was first told. And the version that came before raises a question the Grimm brothers never wanted us to ask. What were people really trying to remember? The story didn't begin in Germany. It didn't begin with the Grimm brothers, or even with Charles Perrault in France. Long before anyone wrote it down, this tale was already moving, spoken in dialects that no longer exist, carried across mountains and rivers by people whose names we'll never know. What we call Little Red Riding Hood is not one story. It's many stories, wearing different faces. In northern Italy, they told a version called The False Grandmother. There was no red cloak, no wolf. The predator was an ogre, or sometimes a werewolf, a creature that walked on two legs but wasn't quite human. The girl was often older in these tellings, sent on an errand through dangerous country. When she arrived at her grandmother's house, the door was already open. In some alpine regions, the story became even stranger. The girl would arrive to find her grandmother butchered. The creature that killed her, still wearing the old woman's clothes, would offer the girl food. In the darkest versions, the girl would unknowingly eat her own grandmother's flesh before realizing what sat across from her. There was no rescue in these tellings, no huntsman with an axe. The girl either escaped through cleverness, or she didn't escape at all. These weren't considered horror stories. They were warnings, lessons, survival knowledge passed from one generation to the next, in places where the forest was not a metaphor but an actual danger, and where strangers on the road could mean death. The pattern was always the same, even when the details changed. A young person, a journey through isolation, a predator who deceives. A test of recognition: will the girl see the danger before it's too late? The structure repeated because it needed to. It was teaching something. In 1697, Charles Perrault collected several of these oral tales and published them in Paris under the title Histoires ou contes du temps passé, stories or tales of past times. Among them was Le Petit Chaperon Rouge. Perrault was writing for the French court, and he shaped the story to fit the tastes of aristocratic readers. He added elegance, he added morality, but he didn't add a rescue. In Perrault's version, the girl meets the wolf in the forest. He's charming, persuasive, dressed in words that sound like concern. He convinces her to take the longer path, the one through the flowers. She listens, she delays. When she finally arrives at her grandmother's house, the wolf is waiting in the bed. Perrault describes the famous exchange, the questions about ears and eyes and teeth, but when the wolf reveals himself, there's no one to save her. The girl is devoured. The story ends. Perrault added a moral at the conclusion, written in verse, warning young women about the dangers of listening to strangers, especially handsome ones. He wasn't subtle. In his telling, the wolf isn't just a wolf. He's a seducer, a man with bad intentions. The forest is the world. The cloak is innocence. His version wasn't meant for children. It was meant for young women at court, where real predators wore fine clothes and spoke with refinement. But even Perrault's version wasn't the oldest. Folklorists have traced similar tales back much further, into oral traditions that stretch across Europe and beyond. Some scholars place the story's origins in medieval France, others in pre-Christian ritual warnings. The tale appears in so many cultures, in so many forms, that it becomes difficult to say where it truly began. What remains consistent is the structure, the journey, the deception, the predator, the moment of recognition that comes too late, or just in time. In some versions, the girl is clever. She tells the wolf she needs to step outside to relieve herself, and when he ties a rope around her ankle to keep her from running, she unties it and escapes. In others, she's devoured, and the story becomes a tragedy, a cautionary tale with no hope of reversal. The Grimm Brothers, when they encountered this story in German-speaking regions over a century after Perrault, made a choice. They added the huntsman, they added the rescue, they turned the ending from a warning into a redemption. It's possible they did this because they were publishing for families, and they believed children needed hope, not horror. Or perhaps they were recording a version that had already been softened by the communities that told it. Either way, their version became the dominant one, the story that survived into modernity. But the older versions didn't disappear. They remained in regional folklore, in academic collections, in the memories of people who heard them as children and remembered them as adults. What all of these versions suggest is this: the story was never about one girl, or one wolf, or one forest. It was about a pattern that repeated across time and geography because the danger it described was universal. Young people have always had to cross thresholds. Predators have always known how to disguise themselves. Trust has always been a gamble. The tale survived because it taught something people needed to know. And they told it, again and again, in whatever form made sense for their time and place. The names changed, the settings shifted, but the shape beneath the story remained. And it's that shape older than any written version, older than any single culture, that tells us this tale was never just a fairy story. It was a memory of something real. There's a reason the cloak is red. Not blue, not green, not the practical brown of peasant clothing. Red, bright, and unmistakable. A color that draws the eye, that announces presence, that can't be hidden or ignored. In the older versions of this story, the ones told in villages where every image carried weight, that red cloak wasn't just a detail. It was a signal. Some folklorists believe it marked the girl as someone in transition. Red, in many European traditions, was the color of blood, of fertility, of the body's transformation from childhood into something else. To wear red was to announce that change had begun, or was about to. The girl in the red cloak wasn't a child anymore. She was becoming a woman. And the forest she walked through wasn't just trees and shadows. It was the world beyond her mother's protection, the threshold she would have to cross alone, whether she was ready or not. The story, in its oldest oral forms, may have functioned as an initiation warning. Not a myth, not a fantasy. A lesson encoded in narrative, designed to prepare young women for a specific danger they would inevitably face. The wolf, in this reading, was never just an animal. In medieval and early modern Europe, wolves were real threats. They killed livestock, attacked travelers, haunted the edges of settlements. But in stories like this one, the wolf also represented something else, something human. A man with predatory intent, a stranger who speaks kindly, someone who knows how to wear trust like a disguise. The girl's mistake isn't that she enters the forest, it's that she stops to talk. She reveals where she's going. She listens to the wolf's suggestions. She steps off the path. Every choice she makes is reasonable in the moment. The wolf seems concerned. Picking flowers for her grandmother seems thoughtful. The detour seems harmless. But the story is teaching her and the listeners that danger doesn't always look dangerous. That predators understand how to seem safe. That the moment you realize you've been deceived is often the moment it's too late. This wasn't abstract symbolism for the people who told this tale. It was survival knowledge. In communities where young women were sent on errands alone, where roads were isolated and help was far away, the ability to recognize deception could mean the difference between safety and violence. The story didn't just warn against wolves. It warned against misplaced trust, against the assumption that kindness always means safety. The forest, in this context, represents the passage every young person must make from the known world into the unknown one, from protection into independence. The girl can't avoid the journey. She has to bring food to her grandmother. She has to walk the path. What the story tests is whether she'll remember the warnings she was given. When the girl arrives at her grandmother's house and notices something wrong, the voice sounds strange. The door is unlocked. The figure in the bed doesn't look quite right. She's being given a chance to recognize the danger. The questions she asks, what big ears you have, what big eyes you have, are her way of testing what she suspects. But she doesn't leave. She stays close enough to be devoured. In versions of the tale that end without rescue, this is the lesson. Recognition without action means nothing. Seeing the danger isn't enough. You have to leave before the wolf shows his teeth. In medieval peasant culture, where sexual violence was a real and constant threat, this story may have served as one of the few ways communities had to prepare their daughters for what they might encounter. There were no police, no legal protections that meant anything for a girl on a country road. What they had were stories passed from mother to daughter, told around fires, embedded in memory. The tale wasn't about morality in the way we think of it now. It wasn't about being good or pure. It was about being smart, about learning to see predation before it shows itself fully, about understanding that the world outside the village contained people who would harm you if you let them close enough. This is why the older versions are so much darker than what survived. They weren't trying to comfort, they were trying to prepare, and preparation, in that world, required honesty about what could happen. The red cloak marked the girl as vulnerable. The forest was the space where that vulnerability would be tested. The wolf was the shape danger takes when it wants to get close to you. And the story was the only defense some girls ever received. It wasn't a perfect defense. Stories never are. But in a world where young women were expected to navigate danger alone, this tale offered something. A pattern to recognize, a warning to remember, a reason to hesitate before trusting a voice in the woods. The symbolic meanings embedded in this story weren't inventions. They were reflections of lived experience, shaped by generations of people who understood that survival required more than luck. It required knowledge. And knowledge, in oral cultures, lived inside stories. This is what the tale did for the people who told it. It gave them a way to say what couldn't always be said directly. It let them teach without lecturing, warn without frightening, prepare without promising safety. Because safety was never guaranteed. Only the warning could be passed down. We still tell this story. Centuries after it first moved through villages where wolves were real and the forest meant danger, we still give it to children. We still recognize the girl in the red cloak. We still know what happens when she strays from the path. The details have changed. The endings have softened, but the shape remains. A girl, a forest, a wolf. That core survives because it holds something we haven't finished understanding. Something we recognize without always knowing why. Stories disappear all the time. Thousands of folk tales that were once told with the same care and repetition as Little Red Riding Hood have been forgotten when the communities that carried them dissolved, when the language they were told in stopped being spoken, when the dangers they warned against no longer felt urgent. But this one stayed. It stayed through the transition from oral culture to written record. It stayed through Perrault's courtly revision, through the Grimm Brothers' moral editing, through Disney's adaptations and modern retellings. It stayed even as the world it was born into disappeared completely. The question isn't whether the story is true, it's why we needed it to survive. One answer might be memory, not individual memory, but the kind that lives in culture, the way communities hold on to knowledge that no longer has obvious use, but still feels necessary. Little Red Riding Hood may be one of those remnants, a fragment of older awareness preserved inside a form people couldn't quite let go of. The story taught something once. It prepared young women for a specific kind of danger. It encoded survival knowledge in a structure simple enough to remember, vivid enough to repeat, unsettling enough to take seriously. But that world, the one where girls walked alone on forest paths, where predators were both animal and human, where help was often too far away to matter, that world is gone. And yet we still tell the story. Perhaps we tell it because the danger it describes didn't entirely disappear. The shapes changed, the settings shifted. But the pattern, the predator who deceives, the trust that's exploited, the moment of recognition that comes too late, that pattern is still recognizable. The story survives because what it warns against is still real, even if the wolf no longer looks like a wolf. There's another possibility though, one that's harder to name. Maybe the story endured not because we need the warning, but because we need the memory of being warned. Because there's something in us that responds to the idea that our ancestors tried to prepare us, that they encoded their fears and knowledge into forms we would carry forward without fully understanding. Little Red Riding Hood may be one of those forms, a story that did something important once, and now exists as a reminder that stories can do important things, that narrative isn't decoration, but a way of holding truth when truth can't be spoken directly. The tale has been softened, the wolf has been defeated, the girl has been rescued. We've added morals and happy endings and removed the parts we found too dark, too strange, too uncomfortable. But underneath all those revisions, the original shape is still there. You can feel it. The girl stepping off the path, the wolf wearing the grandmother's face, the moment when everything familiar becomes dangerous. That's the part we can't quite erase, no matter how many times we rewrite the ending, because that part is true. Not literally, not historically, but emotionally, structurally, fundamentally. It's true in the way warnings are true, not because they describe one specific event, but because they describe a possibility that exists every time a threshold is crossed, every time trust is extended, every time someone vulnerable meets someone with power. The tale doesn't tell us what to do with that truth. It just holds it, preserves it, passes it forward. And maybe that's enough. The Grimm brothers thought they were collecting folklore. Perrault thought he was educating young aristocrats. The people who first told this story, whoever they were, wherever they lived, probably thought they were simply doing what needed to be done. Teaching their daughters, preparing them, giving them something to remember when they walked alone. They couldn't have known the story would survive this long, that it would outlive their language, their villages, their entire way of life. But it did. And what remains is not a simple tale, and not a complete one. What remains is an echo, a warning preserved in a shape we recognize without always understanding. A memory of a time when stories weren't entertainment, they were survival. We tell this story because we've always told it, because it was given to us by people who needed us to remember something. And even though we've forgotten most of what they were trying to say, even though we've softened the ending and dressed the wolf in gentler forms, the girl still walks into the forest, the wolf still waits. And somewhere, in the part of us that listens to old stories in the dark, we still know what that means.